But we're really excited to have you. And I think I've just mentioned two things about Allison that I've discovered with working with her, which I think illustrate how remarkable she is. One, she only started learning about birds when she took IB 104 last spring. And has now become really an expert on it, and I think the data set she's put together for her honors thesis is really amazing. The other thing that I don't know how many people know is that she's actually manager of the Cal Band, which involves organizing trips for a whole 250 people, managing their budgets and lots of other commitments. And she still managed to keep that up and acquire time to both volunteer in the museum and collect her honors thesis there. So really she's done an amazing job in the last year. So over to you.
All right. Well, thank all of you for coming today. Quite a bit of turnout. So, my thesis, 93 years after Canal, I resurveyed the Redwood campus, aka Crazy Cool Bird Surveys. During this talk, I will be going over background and motivation, prior surveys, methodology, key observations that I've made, and then findings and conclusions. Starting with background and motivation. So many of you in this room know who Joseph Grinnell is, but not all of you. He was the first director of the MUZ in 1908 and was director until 1939. During that time, he led many extensive expeditions, especially throughout California, gathering all sorts of specimens. And even more than the or not even more important, but very important with these specimens, he would document very clearly where they were found, field notes, did many bird surveys, which is one reason why our collection is so valuable today, because now we can go back and as they're doing on the Grinnell Survey Project and resurvey these places, and you can definitely see how things have changed over the century. As Grinnell said, after the lapse of many years, possibly a century, the student of the future will have access to the original record of faunal conditions in California. Here's Grinnell up here, here's Grinnell here. Over the last century. So why do we care about doing resurveys? Well, there have been quite a few changes in the last century, including a lot of habitat destruction, as many of you know, and not only that, but land use changes. You can see in the eastern United States where there was once a lot of farmland has become forests now, and so you actually get a lot of species changes that you would expect. Global warming, pretty widely accepted now, especially for the scientific community. So you can see how that's affecting changes, as well as population growth. The population has basically tripled over the last century and is expected to greatly increase in the next few years. As Margaret White, in her paper in 1927, which I'll talk to you about later, said, a survey of campus bird life from time to time to determine the effects of these conditions upon the bird population presents an interesting theme for study, which I definitely agree with her. Now a little bit about the history of campus. So you can tell from these various aerial photos, one in 1919, 1936, and then 2007, there has been quite a bit of land change on campus. Now, looking at these number of buildings, now these buildings are just in my study area, which I will describe to you a little later. There were 22 in 1913, 26 in 1938, and 31 in 2006. Now you may be thinking, if you look at the difference in the land use change, all these open areas have disappeared, how can there be, you would expect more buildings. However, what the university has been doing over the years is knocking down old small buildings and building up huge ones in their place, such as the OSB. But in particular, you notice that these large open expanses of grass, and where you might expect some of the ground feeders that use that habitat to live in, have disappeared. Trees on campus. Originally, campus was basically an oak woodland, as you see many around today, and it had some species of trees, but not nearly the amount of species that you see today. In between 1870 and 1900, there were extensive planting of trees and other shrubs, bringing a lot of exotics. A lot of this was done for agricultural purposes. They would plant the trees here and then see how they did. In 1973, over 300 species of tree was documented. So you can see just the amount of exotic species that have campus. Another thing which makes sense due to the time period, you can see that the trees have matured and developed and are now much taller and fuller than they originally were. You can see this is doe right here. Just over the years, the number of trees have increased as well with different species. I don't know how many of you know this, but botanical gardens used to be where Memorial Glade is today. So you can imagine that there were extensive species and habitat that was used by many of the more shrub-dwelling species that is no longer there. In 1909, you can see all sorts of shrub-type plants. In 1924, they were moved from their original location up into the Berkeley Hills. But you'll notice in 1936, there's still quite a bit of foliage there, so there's a quite a big remnant of botanical gardens. However, in the 60s, when they built the main stacks, I'm going to guess that they just had to dig up this whole area, which is why it's basically just a cultivated lawn today. And there have been many major changes of the landscape on campus. However, not everywhere. There's quite a few places where you can actually see the landscape hasn't changed much. These are both bridges that you lead to University House, and this is what used to be called Agriculture Hall and is now known as Wellness Hall. So in general, landscape changes over the last century. There are more buildings. The trees have matured, especially the exotic trees which were planted in the early century. The botanical gardens have been lost, and the cultivated lawns have kind of spread out over any of the open areas. And as well as difference in buildings, I'm sure you figured out, the student enrollment has greatly increased as well. In 1913, the students barely reached 4,000. In 1938, there were a few more than 15,000, and this year there were just around 33,000 students. And this is just the number of students, not the number of faculty or the people who work on campus who aren't faculty. So you can imagine, with all those numbers added in, just how much more foot traffic the campus has today. Now on to prior surveys. So the first survey time that I'm using is between the year 1913 and 1918. In 1914, Grinnell published a second list of the birds of the Berkeley campus. He had many collaborators in this. Some of them which are in these pictures. This is Margaret White. This is Storer. This is Rogers. So, you may be wondering what happened to the first list. That was published in 1911, and the second list is basically just a more complete version of it. So it made sense to use the second list rather than the first original one. The second main source of information in this time period was Margaret White, who was one of the contributors to that second list. She lived from 1880 to 1958 and was hired in 1912 as Grinnell's assistant for 35 cents an hour. Now, over the years, specifically between 1913 and 1927, she kept extensive field notes of the birds on the lower campus. Now, that original second list made by Grinnell encompasses all of campus, including the hills, which is why her field notes on the lower campus have been so useful to me. In particular, as I have laid out on the table here, if you want to come look at them later, she's got these time books during which she listed the number of species on this side, and then you have all the dates up at the top, and then whenever she saw species, she would mark a 1. So it's basically like an Excel spreadsheet, just in the form of little booklets. Another thing she wrote in 1927 was a survey of the bird life on the lower campus of the University of California. And in this, she basically has done a version of my project, but on a smaller time scale. The last sentence of this paper was, as plans for a greater university progress for the next 13 years, and the environment of campus birds undergoes further changes, what will then be the representation of the bird population of the lower campus? Little did she know that 80 years later, I would be answering that question. Now, the second time period that I looked at was between the years 19 1939. The two students of the university at the time, PhD students, completed a survey throughout that year. Thomas L. Rogers, who got his PhD in 1952, and Charles Sibley, who many of you know for his molecular phylogeny work on birds, who got his PhD in 1949, both of these from Miller. They wrote Frequency of Occurrence of Birds on the Berkeley campus, University of California. It was published in 1914 in the Congo. And while most of the paper didn't really apply to my work, they had this excellent chart, which is also like an Excel spreadsheet, just in paper form, that I basically, when writing my methodology, tried to duplicate. They went out 10 days a month for a year, and wrote down every black square indicates whenever they saw a species. So to sum that up, in 1913, we've got Margaret West's surveys, and also Grinnell's paper. In 1938, we've got Rogers and Sibley in their paper. In 2006, we've got my work. Methodology. Historic survey methods. So Margaret White, when she would do her surveys, often had a route at noon that she would walk through the botanical gardens and around Lower Campus. It was often a half an hour or so. The sightings she made, she also recorded whenever she saw like a bird right outside the MDC. One of the favorite places was the oak at the corner of the MDC, which is not in its current location today. The MDC was up more near Faculty Lake. Rogers and Sibley, they had a more specific way that they did things. They did 3 transects throughout the day. In the morning, they would have an indirect approach to VLSD from either North Gate, South Gate, or West Gate. Noon, they would walk around the campus buildings, and then in the late afternoon, they would take an indirect route across campus. So basically, they did 3 line transects where they kept track of the birds they saw. And they also recorded any birds that they heard from their classroom windows and while walking through classes. Now, when I did my surveys, I tried to kind of emulate what they did as much as possible. And one thing that they did was limit the area of study to this is Hearst, Oxford, Alston, and then Campanile was the westernmost border. So one critical thing you might notice in here is that Sproul Plaza is not included in this area. So there are a fair amount of species that you see on Sproul Plaza that I'll tell you about later that don't occur anywhere else on campus. I used point counts instead of line transects because you can get species abundance data from these that could be used by future surveys, and so you can actually do abundance comparisons as well as just how many species you see. I had my 3 transects and tried to cover this area as best as possible. I did 6 points per transect, 10 minutes at each point after talking to CJ Ralph, who advised me on that because I was doing my surveys during the winter time. And I would do 1 in the morning, 1 right around noon, and 1 in the late afternoon. And I randomized which survey I did at which time. I also, if I saw any birds that I hadn't seen on my transects between classes, I would write those down. Now, due to the nature of this being my honors thesis, and only having however many months is in the school year to do it, I started in October and went through the month of March for my observations, which means that the species that I see on campus are largely the winter residents and permanent residents. And I went out 10 days a month, just as Rogers and Sibley did as well. Now, in order to compare these different time periods, I did contingency table comparison and looked at significant changes that had a p-value of less than 0.001, so something that would be considered highly significant. One problem that I ran across was the difference in sampling effort. So you can see that between 1938 and 2006, we had pretty similar sampling effort times. However, in 1913, because of the short duration of Margaret West's walks, the hours she spent were much less than before. And I used her data from 1913 to 1918 to try and account for this, so you can see the number of days is much greater. However, because she spent so little time actually surveying, that's when I pulled in to account the second list of the birds on the Berkeley campus. So after doing my contingency table comparisons, I looked at what was highly significant, and then looked at how Grinnell described the species in the second list of the Berkeley campus. For example, if I saw something that looked like it greatly increased between 1913 and 1938, yet Grinnell said it was common on the lower campus, I decided that she probably just didn't see that species for whatever reason. And so included that in my analysis. Now, doing surveys on campus, there are several challenges that you have to deal with when doing surveys out in other more natural areas. I made enemies with the lawnmower man and the leaf blower man, who were often active during the morning. Between classes, you would get just the mad rush of people, which are very noisy, make it difficult to do point counts, as well as any construction noise. On the weekends, it was much more quiet, but then you've got all the dogs that are running around and scaring all the birds away. And then, I don't know if it was just because I was standing there and looked like a friendly person, but people were always asking me for directions. And just talking to me in general. Some people would point out the fox squirrels that they saw to me. They were kind of very helpful. So now to look for some of my observations. Now, when looking at the total species seen, you can see that there's a general trend of increasing. And I only included 1 year of Margaret White's surveys just so I can it could be more equivalent. Although in total, from 1913 to 1980, she saw 57 species. Now, when trying to disclude some of the vagrants or some of the summer residents that were coming in at the end of the surveys, after discluding species that were seen less than 25% of the time, you can see that there's still a general increase in species. Now, between 1913 and 1938, you can see there are a fair amount of increases in species. Actually, the California gull was completely added to this. They hadn't seen it anywhere previously. This is largely probably due to the increase in students and trash and other, that the gulls like to eat. Between 1913 and 1938, there was a decrease in American kestrel as well as the rented. And the rented actually was almost completely lost from campus. They're not present in any of the later observations. And that makes sense if you think about how rentids are generally associated with chaparral habitats and other scrub bushes, yet those have disappeared from campus. Now, between 1938 and 2006, there are quite a few species that increased in number. I can imagine that is in part due to the maturation of the trees. You've got things like the brown creeper, which like to live in those big trees, and the warblers, the dark-eyed junco. There are actually quite a few species which were completely added. The red-shouldered hawk, Cooper's hawk, mourning dove, white-throated swift, Nuttall's woodpecker, American crow, common raven, chestnut chickadee, and American goldfinch. Now, these hawks, I'll talk a little bit later about why they may have increased. The mourning dove, I'm not really sure why they suddenly appeared on campus. You would think they would have been there before, but there are no records of them. Nuttall's woodpecker has expanded its range. American crows and common ravens have expanded in a lot of places. The chestnut chickadee has greatly expanded its range in tax years as well, which probably account for that. American goldfinch. Now, between 1938 and 2006, there are also several decreases, as well as species that were lost. California quail, American kestrel, American pipit, and spotted toad. Now, the California quail, pipit, and toad kind of also makes sense due to the loss of the brush-type habitats that they like to live in, the botanical gardens, leaving. One very interesting loss, or near loss, were the white-crowned, golden-crowned sparrows and the song sparrows. I only saw one white-crowned sparrow and one golden-crowned sparrow, and then after talking to Dr. Beidelman, who's been keeping track of the species seen on campus, walking to and from for several years, he also has never seen those sparrows. So I can only surmise that this is due to the loss of the feeding habitat that they like to live in. Now, there was a general trend amongst all these species that have decreased and were lost. They were all ground feeders. This was the only real general trend of species being added or lost that you can see thing just we can look at is that this is 2006 surveys. That generally, I had the winter and permanent residents. However, in March, you can see with the spike in the number of species that you can see some of the migrants and the summer residents coming in. So another very interesting thing that could be done in the future is to do this surveys for an entire year. Now to apply this to the literature. So some points that were in the literature is that species richness and abundance are higher in areas of intermediate disturbance. I would consider campus an area of intermediate disturbance. After looking at several papers which classify these areas, for example, they consider a golf course an area of intermediate disturbance. The campus you get there's a lot of buildings, a lot of foot traffic, yet there are still a fair amount of habitat that the birds can live in. So that could account for one reason why there's been an increase in species, and also differences between, for example, campus and just cross over into the more urban Berkeley City. As time from development increases, bird communities become more distinct from the native community. This is definitely true because the numbers of species generally were the same, yet the community composition is changing. As you can see from the species that have decreased, a lot of those native oak woodland species are decreasing or have dropped out altogether, while more exotic species are coming in. For example, the cedar waxwings, which have increased over the years, likely due to the trees that produce berries. Brings me to the next point. Managed urban areas tend to increase exotic plants, shifting the bird community composition, which very much complements the previous point about the exotic species. With the growth of all the redwood trees has led to the increases in creepers and probably some of the Steller's jays and other larger birds. And supplemental food resources benefit granivores, nectarivores, and omnivores. This is definitely true. The omnivores, the crows, the ravens, probably from go to Sproul Plaza, there's trash on the ground everywhere, food scraps. The nectarivores, there are a fair amount of hummingbird feeders around campus. I know hung by some of you in the audience, which could help their numbers, as well as the blooming eucalyptus grove in the wintertime. Just a ton of hummingbirds and also yellow-rumped warblers that feed there. Interestingly, there are people that do spread out grain and oats for the birds. So you would think there would be things like white-crowned and golden-crowned sparrows around taking advantage of this. However, there aren't. Blair in 1996 classified certain species from the general oak woodland habitat into 3 classifications. The first of them is urban avoiders. Now, my data sometimes matches up with what he thought. For example, the wren-tit are an urban avoider, and you can tell because the wren-tit has disappeared that this would be true. However, he also classified the dark-eyed junco, the Steller's jay, and Hepton's vireo as urban avoiders. And I don't know how many of you know what a dark-eyed junco looks like, but you can see those everywhere on campus. They're one of the most important birds. He also had 3 urban explorers. The white-throated swift has increased over the years and can likely be found nesting on several of the buildings around campus, including the campanile. Interestingly enough, you don't find rock pigeons and house sparrows on this part of campus. If you go into Sproul Plaza, you'll find them. If you cross over into Berkeley City, you'll find them. But there are none in this area. I'm not exactly sure why this is. Perhaps because of the Cooper socks and red-shouldered socks which are around. But I would think that you would find rock pigeons, which are your normal everyday pigeons, around. But they're not here. His third category was suburban adaptable. And there were several species that agreed with this classification. Chestnut-backed chickadee, bush chits, American robins, Anna's hummingbird, house finch, black phoebes, mourning dove, and Meadows woodpecker. These have all generally increased over the years, if not been added to campus altogether. But there are also some that have decreased, as you would expect. Western scrub jay, spotted towhee, California quail, and oak titmouse, which is very interesting because there are no California quail around anymore. And then a fair amount of these had no change over the years. So So the species in black, which I didn't mention, are species that either don't occur on campus because of this particular area, or species that are here during the summer, which is not when my study took place, so I couldn't say anything about them. Now, the fact that these species designations sometimes agree and sometimes disagree suggests to me is that there needs to be more of an ecological look at the species classifications. And such things, you can think about things like the fact that ground feeders have basically disappeared. Perhaps that's a common thread throughout the urban environments. Talking about predators on campus, today that there are few feral cats, but due to the nature of pest control, and there actually aren't very many feral cats on campus. And I read in a paper that a decrease in large mammals results in an increase in domestic cats. I've yet to see a coyote or a mountain lion on campus, so that would mean that. And also the increase in population of people around campus would lead me to think that sometimes there are domestic cats that would come on campus and possibly kill birds. Fox squirrels were introduced to campus in 1926. I'm sure many of you have noticed the squirrels around campus. They're very abundant and can be nest predators on birds. And small raptors also have become more abundant. These small raptors generally feed on birds as well. As far as raptors go, generally raptors are fairly urban adaptable. This is largely due to less persecution and ample food supply. It's been shown that small accipiters, such as the Cooper's hawk, which is on campus, respond positively to this. This is probably largely due to the abundant small birds around that often will be clumped in one place, such as around a feeder. It's easier for them to take dinner. Red-shouldered hawks have shown to have a very varied response to urban habitats. Yet, due to the fact that campus is a fairly intermediate habitat, it makes sense that they are around. I'm pretty sure they just come down from the hills and use campus as a feeding ground. Falcons are supposed to do well on campus, which the fact that the American kestrel has decreased, I find very interesting. I'm not exactly sure why that is. And Dr. Beidelman also reported to me a couple of years ago a peregrine falcon would perch on the campanile and hunt from there. So, a couple interesting points Margaret White had in her paper. The locality of the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology is favorable for many lucky observations, and most concerned is the large live oak erected at the corner of the building. It was in this tree that the writer detected a chestnut-backed chickadee, October 4th, 1913. So she wrote about this remarkable occurrence. If you look at her field notes, she writes for pages about this chestnut-backed chickadee. And if you look today, chestnut-backed chickadees are one of the most common birds on campus. And another quote, probably the most exciting record from the museum was the chance of sighting two white-throated swifts flying about the campanile on April 9, 1924. Once again, these white-throated swifts are now somewhat common on campus. It's not such an exciting record. So conclusions. In general, the number of species has stayed pretty similar. It's increased a little bit. The community has changed. There are more species that are associated with the larger trees, more species that are associated with the exotic plants. Campus is an intermediate habitat, and urban designations on species need to look more at their ecological roles and other possibilities other than just one study where they look at what's disappeared over time. Margaret White kind of summed it up in her paper when she said, to repeat, of all the inevitable changes being wrought upon the lower campus of the University of California, the work of the landscape gardener has been the most detrimental continuance of the former bird population within the area during the period from 1914 to the present time. So I think that her quote back in 1927 is still true today. I would really like to thank everybody in the MVZ who's helping us and people not in the MVZ who have offered me moral support. The MVZ has just offered me so much in the last year and a half or so, helping me develop my passion for birds, which is now taking over my life. And all of you who gave me advice, however small. And just kind of a fun picture. This is the MVZ back in 1873 when I was in Bacon Hall, not really the MVZ. Yet you can see some of the specimen species are still around. There's our favorite albatross. And here's our next reactive antlers. And then both of these large skeletons over in the corner look very much like these two skeletons. So, any questions?
Urban happy and some is urban avoiders.
Yeah.
What do you think are the major differences in campus and the ecological factors on campus compared to the urban areas that paper was considering that might account for the differences the birds use?
Well, what that paper did was they chose several areas around Palo Alto. See that light there? That looked at the species that disappeared. Now, in those particular areas that they chose, there might have been other factors that could account for those species disappearing. The landscape might have changed differently in those areas than it has on campus.
So are you going to continue your observations through the spring and summer?
I would love to. However, because these observations take so much of my time, basically it takes a total of 3.5 hours a day, 10 days a month, which chops the day up. I wouldn't have time to analyze my data if I kept collecting my data. And since I'll be gone so much this summer on the Grinnell project, I won't be around to continue my observations.
So were house sparrows present? I do not remember from your earlier slides whether house sparrows were present on campus when you were doing the surveys.
They were, actually. Grinnell classifies house sparrows as a pretty common resident on campus. Yet they pretty much greatly declined over time. Maybe possibly moved just into the city of Berkeley or into the Sprout Plaza type area.
You think there's an interaction between house sparrows and bat businesses?
Could be. That'd be interesting to look at. Definitely.
Yeah, I have a similar question with the house finches and the purple finches. With the East Coast, the house finches are producers, so they spread and push down pollen and other birds. So that the house finches common on campus.
They were somewhat common, not quite as common as they are today. They have definitely increased in number. So that could definitely, species interactions could have something to do with the decline in certain numbers of birds. Purple finches have generally declined in numbers between then and today. That's kind of what a decline and then a decline. So perhaps interacting with house finches could have something to do with that.
Okay, any more questions?
So based on some of the rates of change that you see here, when would you recommend another set of surveys being done?
I would recommend surveys be done, I would say every 20 years maybe. It seems fairly frequent, but as you can tell just over the 4 years I've been here how much construction has taken place, and I feel like change, the campus is growing so fast that change is going to take place more rapidly. So 20 years will probably be indicated.
Did your area include the Grinnell Grove?
It did. It included.
That's one area that was competitive. Huge battle with the 22 articles to allow that concept of dead free. Yeah, so there's nothing from progress, but I know it's single battle.
Yeah, looking back through just the landscape, notes from the landscape architects in general is very interesting because you would get one that would recommend campus be a park-like area, then you would get one later that would recommend a more natural type habitat, and you would get one later which would recommend something else, and so that's why you can see there's kind of a variation of habitats on campus.
Another trend that you sort of alluded to is the decline in the amount of brush and so on. And that also is a conscious effort for so-called safety reasons to do away with brush, and that I'm sure goes back to the walk of law and you mentioned the mystery about the learning dog. I think in those early days, the learning dog was a favorite honey dog species that was really quite well and it's the kind of thing that you tend to do.
about the availability of free water on campus and the creek courses. Has any of that changed since 1913? And at some points the creeks were covered and some of them weren't, or the associated riparian, quote, riparian vegetation.
No, I haven't thought a ton about how Strawberry Creek could have affected. I know there has been mention of Strawberry Creek in the past surveys, so I'm going to guess that Strawberry Creek was still around, but that would definitely be something to look into. Yeah.
Have you compared your results to wider population changes for species like the red-shouldered hawk has just exploded around Central California here?
Yeah, I have been. I haven't looked specifically at like Northern California changes yet. That's kind of an area that I've been wanting to go into. It's just a matter of me having time. But yeah, just I know the Chesapeake chickens have exploded, and I'm sure that other species have as well.
Okay, I think we'll stop there. Thank you, Adam.